Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into one of the most talked about concepts in personal finance, when we recently saw ignite a huge debate, what some are calling the American dream lie.
Yeah, that video certainly got people talking. But before we even start analyzing the sources for this deep dive, we want to make one thing crystal clear to you. We are absolutely not against real estate investing or homeownership. Not at all.
Definitely not.
In fact, we're already planning a few upcoming deep dives that will explore how powerful the real estate market can actually be when you approach it correctly.
But here's the thing. If we are going to teach the full picture of smart investing and help you see all the angles, there's some hard truths and, well, financial realities we simply can't ignore or sugarcoat. Our mission here is to question the conventional wisdom, teach you the mechanics of compounding, and show you the full financial picture for smart, successful investing.
Precisely. Today, our mission is breaking down that cherished image of the single-family home, the so-called American dream, and revealing why, for some people, it can actually be a bit of a financial illusion compared to a dedicated, disciplined investing elsewhere.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with a really jarring idea from one of the greatest investors ever, Warren Buffett. He famously called buying a house a lousy investment.
Right.
What exactly is he talking about? I mean, for most people, their home is their single biggest asset. How can the Oracle of Omaha just dismiss it like that?
Well, it's important to understand why he said that. Buffett's critique is purely financial, right? It centers entirely on capital allocation and opportunity cost.
Okay.
We need to frame this not just as some casual quote, but as a deep strategic decision he made. Look, Buffett bought his own house eventually, of course,
Sure.
but he deliberately delayed buying it until the down payment was only about 10% of his entire net worth. He just didn't want to tie up that capital unnecessarily.
And he had that quote, didn't he? He said using all his capital to buy a house was like a carpenter who's had his tools taken away from him. That's a really powerful analogy.
It is.
But why did he estimate the implicit return you get from buying a home is only around 7% or maybe 8%? To a lot of people, that probably sounds pretty good, pretty stable.
It's all about comparison. He was looking at the historical returns of the broad stock market, which, averaged closer to 10% over decades,
Right.
versus housing appreciation, which historically, nationally, hovers closer to maybe 3%. And that's before you even factor in any costs.
Okay. Costs are key.
Exactly. So when you calculate the actual internal rate of return on owning a home, accounting for all the fees, the maintenance, the taxes, everything, that 7% or 8% is an implicit return. For him, at certain times, that might have been lower than even the risk-free rate available, and it was certainly much lower than his own ability to generate returns investing in businesses.
So in his world, 7% was just mediocre,
Yeah.
a poor use of valuable capital.
For his capital, yes. Mediocre compared to other opportunities he saw.
Okay, now that mindset makes sense for a mega investor like Buffett. But for the average person, we've been told our whole lives that owning a single-family home is the guaranteed path to building wealth. Where did that idea get so ingrained if the numbers don't always stack up?
Well, some of the sources we looked at refer to that really pervasive image, the house with the white picket fence, as a result of decades of pretty intense marketing and promotion.
Marketing?
Yeah, sometimes even labeled propaganda. Think about organizations like the National Association of Realtors, other industry groups. They have long promoted this specific look, this aesthetic, as the definition of success. It creates this psychological pull that's way stronger than any spreadsheet,
Yeah, I can see that. And the most important financial point here, the real insight, is that the numbers that used to support this dream are completely disconnected from today's reality.
Exactly. That's the critical historical disconnect. Decades ago, maybe your parents' or grandparents' generation, a house cost roughly 2.5 times your annual income.
Okay.
You'd probably put 20% down. And your total monthly housing costs, mortgage, maintenance, insurance, taxes, everything were maybe 30% or less of your gross income. Those rules made homeownership financially pretty sound, almost automatic.
Okay, so give me the modern comparison because I know those ratios have just exploded.
Oh, they're way off. Today, people are often buying houses for 5, 6, sometimes even 10 times their salary.
Wow.
And often with minimal down payments, right, sometimes as low as 3%, or using complex financing. They're operating on this outdated mantra, you should always buy. But in an economic environment where the math often just doesn't support it anymore, especially if they're really stretching their budget thin.
That difference. That's where the financial illusion really takes
That's
hold.
the crux of it.
Now, before we dig into what you called the phantom costs, I want to bring up the strongest counter-argument I always hear, the tax benefits.
Ah, yes. The mortgage interest deduction.
Exactly. Doesn't that 7–8% implicit return look much better once you factor in the tax breaks homeowners supposedly get? Doesn't the MID make owning a house a clearly better deal than just holding cash or renting?
That's a really crucial question, and historically the answer was often yes. Absolutely. However, the sources we reviewed note that today, for the average American, those tax benefits are often significantly overstated.
How so?
Well, think about the 2017 tax reforms. The standard deduction basically doubled.
Right, it got much bigger.
So far fewer Americans actually itemize their deductions anymore. If you don't itemize, you don't get the specific benefit of the mortgage interest deduction, especially in those crucial early years of the loan when most of your payment is interest.
So they just take the standard deduction instead.
Exactly. Plus, you can only deduct property taxes up to a certain limit now anyway. So for many typical first-time home buyers, that guaranteed tax benefit is actually kind of a financial mirage. It doesn't really factor in for them.
Wow, okay. That completely reframes the whole equation then. So let's move past the mortgage itself and really focus on those phantom costs that can eat away at your returns. These are the hidden expenses renters often forget about when they compare costs.
Absolutely. The principal and interest payment, that's just the cover charge, the entry ticket. Right now, you're looking at mortgage rates around 7% for a 30-year loan.
Which is high, historically speaking.
It's the most expensive time to borrow money in about 2 decades. That interest alone is a huge immediate drag on building any equity, especially in the first 10 years or so.
And then if you don't manage that classic 20% down payment,
You get slammed with private mortgage insurance, PMI.
which is just wasted money, isn't it?
Pure dead money. It can add hundreds to your monthly payment, and it protects the lender, not you, until you finally hit that 20% equity mark.
Okay, so beyond the loan costs, what else? You have the non-negotiable stuff.
Right. Property taxes, these fund essential local services like schools, roads, police,
Things you need.
things you absolutely need. But the cost can rise unpredictably based on local budgets and assessments. And then there's the mandated insurance.
Homeowners insurance.
Legally required if you have a mortgage. It typically costs, maybe $150 to $200 a month on average. But that price is spiking in many areas because of climate change risks and rising rebuilding costs.
Right. Renters pay these things too, but indirectly through their rent payment.
Exactly. Owners pay them directly, and you have zero control when the local tax assessor or your insurance company decides to jack up the rates.
Okay, but the real gut punch, the one people really underestimate, I think, is maintenance and repairs. These are the unpredictable, sometimes huge budget killers that make homeowners suddenly go, wait, why isn't my investment growing faster?
This is the silent killer of returns, absolutely, because people just forget to budget for it consistently. The sources suggest a good rule of thumb is budgeting 1% to 2% of the home's value every year for maintenance.
So on a $500,000 house, that's like $5,000 to $10,000 a year, minimum.
Minimum, every single year. And this means those big ticket items aren't theoretical possibilities. They're guaranteed eventual costs. We're talking, $10,000 for a new HVAC system eventually, maybe $15,000 for a new roof down the line, or $5,000 to fix a surprise leak or a flooded basement. These expenses don't build wealth, they just maintain the structure. It requires this continuous infusion of capital just to keep things running.
Which brings us right back to Buffett's main point, opportunity cost.
Exactly. This is the core of his critique. It's the cost of the potential benefits you miss out on when you choose to sink a large, illiquid sum, like that down payment, into a physical structure instead of putting it into an investment that can compound over time with relatively little ongoing input.
Okay, let's run the numbers with a hypothetical comparison. Let's call our home buyer John. He buys a $500,000 house, puts $100,000 down, so 20%. We figured out his true total monthly cash outlay mortgage, average property taxes, insurance, and budgeting that maintenance at $417 a month comes out to $3,778 a month.
Right. Now we have to add the opportunity cost layer.
Yeah.
That $100,000 down payment is money that's now tied up. It's inaccessible, it's not growing, it's not compounding elsewhere.
Okay.
So if we assume even a modest 6% annual return, John missed out on by not investing that $100 into, say, a simple broad index fund.
Yeah.
Well, 6% of 100K is $6,000 a year.
Which is $500 a month.
Exactly. $500 a month in lost potential growth.
So John's real, true monthly cost when you factor in the investment returns he sacrificed, jumps from $3,778 up to $4,278.
No,
Yeah, that's substantially higher than just looking at the mortgage payment.
it really is. Now let's compare John the buyer to, let's say, Jane the renter investor over a typical 10-year holding period. Let's assume John's house appreciates at a conservative 2% annually. After 10 years, factoring in high selling costs and paying off the remaining loan balance, maybe John walks away about $218,000 in cash.
Okay, what kind of return is that?
That gives him an implied annual return of roughly 8%. Now, if appreciation was only 1% annually, which is also plausible in many areas,
Then the return drops fast.
drops down to maybe 5%.
Okay, so what about Jane? She decided to rent a cheaper place. She took that initial $100,000 plus, let's say she saved an extra $5,000 a year because her rent was lower than John's total ownership costs.
No.
And she consistently invested all of that into the stock market.
Right. So assuming a historically accurate long-term average stock market return of 10% on that invested money, after 10 years, Jane's portfolio grows to $339,000.
Wow. Okay. And the return?
That works out to an implied annual return of about 13%. So in this purely financial model, Jane, the disciplined renter investor, ended up significantly better off by about $121,000 in this scenario.
Okay, this is where I have to push back a little, maybe play devil's advocate for John. Jane's success there feels, well, theoretical. It assumes she had almost superhuman discipline, right? Renting cheaper A&D, consistently investing the difference every month for 10 years straight.
That's a fair challenge.
John, on the other hand, was forced to save through his principal payments. He was forced to pay for necessary maintenance. Doesn't that forced discipline, that kind of automatic wealth-building mechanism, maybe justify the potentially lower financial return?
You have just hit on the absolute most important psychological insight of this entire deep dive. You're spot on.
Yep.
John's mechanism is automatic. The bank makes sure he pays down principal. The house demands maintenance eventually. Jane's success relies entirely on radical, proactive personal discipline. The financial model shows that if Jane is disciplined, she likely wins financially over that period.
Big if.
Huge if. Because if she takes that $2,000 monthly difference, her savings from renting cheaper, and spends it on, I don't know, new cars, fancy dinners, vacations, just general lifestyle inflation,
Yeah.
she ends up with maybe little or no net worth growth compared to John. So this isn't just a critique of the asset class. It's really a critique of human behavior and the lack of a forced savings mechanism for renters.
That behavioral reality really highlights the current extreme imbalance we're seeing in many housing markets right now. Our sources are showing that it has literally never been this much more expensive to buy versus rent, dating all the way back to 1970.
The gap is enormous in some places. Look at the examples from markets across the U.S. Owning a median $500,000 home might cost around $4,300 a month all in, but renting a similar unit right down the street could be $1,700 to $2,300.
That's a $2,000 plus monthly difference.
It's a massive burden. And if the buyer doesn't have a really long time horizon, we're talking 7-10 years minimum, they might never even recoup the high transaction costs and all that early interest they paid, let alone build significant equity.
And let's not forget the leverage argument. Homeowners love to boast about using leverage, putting 10% down to control a $500,000 asset. But that leverage cuts both ways, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Leverage magnifies gains, no doubt. If you put 10% down and the house value goes up 10%, boom, you've doubled your equity on paper. Fantastic. But if house values fall 10%, which can and does happen, you've potentially lost 100% of your initial equity. You're underwater. You're essentially making a highly levered bet on future appreciation. And if that appreciation turns out to be mediocre, which historically it often is nationally, the financial results can be really quite devastating.
Okay, so that leads us perfectly to the alternative. If real estate is this highly levered bet that requires constant feeding through maintenance and costs, what's the reliable, deleveraged, time-tested alternative that investors like Buffett seem to prioritize?
The alternative path really starts by shifting your mindset and your capital away from lazy assets, primarily excess cash, towards assets that compound over time. We have to first confront the biggest enemy of long-term wealth building for many people, and honestly, that's holding too much cash.
And we're not just talking about the money in your wallet for coffee, right?
No, definitely not. The sources we looked at highlighted that over half of Americans keep more than $8,000 just sitting in checking or very low-interest savings accounts. That money isn't just sitting there idly, it's actively losing purchasing power to inflation every single year.
It's eroding.
It's eroding, and crucially, it's not generating those potential 8%, 9%, 10% returns you could be getting elsewhere. Cash, simply put, is the laziest worker you can possibly hire, and it's slowly dying on the job.
This isn't just a financial mistake people make. It feels like a psychological one, too. Why do people hold on to what you called fear money, cash, that clearly exceeds their immediate needs or a reasonable emergency fund?
I think it's because they often conflate safety with liquidity. They want the comfort of seeing that big, stable number in their bank account, even if that number buys less and less each year. They're genuinely terrified of market volatility.
Understandable.
It is understandable, but once you truly grasp the power of compounding, that fear should ideally shift. The concept itself is simple, right? If you take $10,000 and just keep it as cash, in 10 years, guess what? You still have $10,000.
Still $10,000.
Yeah.
Maybe worth less in real terms.
Exactly, worth less due to inflation.
Yeah.
But if you invest that same $10,000 at a pretty modest 8% average annual return, it doubles to over $21,000 in those same 10 years. You've literally earned over $11,000 without sacrificing another single evening or weekend of your time working for it.
That's the magic of compounding. Now, we absolutely need to define the necessary safety net, because we are not saying drain your bank account entirely. This brings us to the idea of the emergency fund trap. How much cash is actually enough?
Right. The emergency fund is crucial, non-negotiable, but it should be calculated pretty strictly based on 3 to 9 months of your core living expenses.
Define core living expenses.
That means your rent or mortgage payment, your essential grocery bills, minimum payments on any debts you have, basic utilities, just the absolute must-pays to keep the lights on and food on the table. Anything significantly above that 9-month buffer often becomes fear money. It's cash that really should be put to work for you. If you're sitting on, say, 24 months of cash, you are actively sacrificing your future net worth potential purely for short-term psychological comfort.
And there's actually a genuine, tangible risk associated with holding too much cash in one place, related to government insurance limits, right?
Exactly. People forget this sometimes. There are government-backed insurance limits on bank deposits. In the U.S., the FDIC covers up to $250,000 per person per insured institution. In the UK, the FSCS covers £85,000.
So if you have more than that in one bank.
If you're approaching or exceeding those amounts in a single bank account, you are taking on unnecessary counterparty risk, especially when that money could be growing safely and reliably in diversified index funds held through a brokerage account, which offers different types of protections like SIPC insurance in the U.S.
Okay, so since we've established that disciplined investing like Jane, investing the difference from renting, often outperforms homeownership purely financially, let's look at the actual tools that make this strategy work. Specifically, low-cost index funds from a major provider.
Right. Index funds are really the core answer here for most people. We used Fidelity as an example provider in our research simply because their fees are incredibly competitive right now. But the strategy applies equally well to other major brokerages like Vanguard or Schwab.
Sure.
But the problem for many learners is choice, isn't it? A big platform like Fidelity might offer over 9,000 different funds. Trying to find the right low-cost option that just tracks the market can feel overwhelming.
Definitely. Analysis paralysis.
Exactly. So we've narrowed it down based on the sources to 4 strategic types of funds that can really help fast-track your path to building wealth and achieving financial freedom.
Okay, let's start with the absolute classic, the
Yeah.
S&P 500 Index Fund. Can't go wrong there, right?
It's the bedrock for many investors. This type of fund simply tracks the performance of the S&P 500 index, the 500 largest publicly traded companies in the U.S. The huge benefit is instant diversification across all the major sectors: tech, healthcare, finance, consumer goods, everything. It really is the definition of a reliable long-term core holding.
And the Fidelity equivalent you mentioned, FXAIX, what's the cost on that?
The cost is almost unbelievable. It has an expense ratio of just 0.015%.
0.015%.
Yes. That translates to just 15 cents in fees for every $5 and dollars you have invested per year. It's practically free.
Wow. And the returns have been historically great.
They have been stellar over the long term. Historically, $10,000 invested in an S&P 500 index fund 10 years ago would be worth nearly $35,000 today, roughly speaking.
Okay, but what's the catch? Or the caveat?
The main caveat is important. It only includes large cap companies. So you miss out entirely on the potentially higher growth rates you might find in mid-sized and smaller companies. And maybe more crucially right now, because it just mirrors the S&P 500 index, it's currently very heavily weighted towards technology stocks.
Like the big tech giant.
Exactly. So if the tech sector experiences a major downturn, this fund, by definition, would be disproportionately affected compared to a broader market fund.
Okay, so if that large cap concentration, especially the heavy tech weighting, is a concern, the next type of fund aims to cover the entire U.S. stock market spectrum, right? The total market index fund.
Precisely. A total market index fund, like Fidelity's FSKAX, for instance, tries to replicate the performance of the entire U.S. stock market. We're talking around 3,000 stocks, large cap, mid cap, and small cap companies, all included. It's often called a one-and-done core holding for U.S. exposure because it's the broadest possible way to bet on the overall health and growth of the entire U.S. economy.
Does it cost significantly more to get that much broader exposure?
Not with the major low-cost providers, surprisingly. FSKAX, for example, has the exact same ultra-low expense ratio, 0.015%.
Still just 15 cents per thousand. Okay. How are the returns compared?
Returns have also been very good, though typically slightly lower than the pure S&P 500 tracker over the recent past. That's mainly because smaller companies haven't performed quite as well as the absolute largest mega-cap stocks lately.
Makes sense.
The strategic benefit of the total market fund is that it spreads your risk much more broadly and potentially offers a better balance between immediate returns and maybe slightly better stability or capturing growth from smaller firms when they eventually outperform. The key guidance here, though, is you generally pick one or the other, either the S&P 500 fund or the total market fund, not both, because there's a huge amount of overlap between them.
Right, you'd basically be doubling up on the big companies. Okay, so that covers the U.S.
Yeah.
But to avoid putting all your eggs in one country's basket, we need to talk about global diversification. That takes us to the third type, the total international index fund.
Yes, international exposure is absolutely critical for true diversification. A fund like Fidelity's FTIHX, for example, tracks the global stock market outside the United States. It invests in thousands of companies across developed markets like Europe and Japan, as well as faster-growing emerging markets in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere.
Is the cost higher for international?
The fee is slightly higher, usually around 0.06% for a broad international index fund like that one, which is still very low, 60 cents per $1,000 invested. But you need international exposure because investment leadership rotates over time.
Meaning the U.S. won't always be the top performer.
Exactly. Our sources clearly show that while the U.S. market has dominated in the last decade or so, that's not always the case historically. International markets often trade at lower valuations compared to the U.S., which could signal better long-term growth potential when, inevitably, market leadership eventually shifts. Plus, international funds often offer a slightly higher dividend yield on average, maybe around 3% or more, which is a nice bonus for income-focused investors.
Okay, that makes sense for diversification. And finally, for the learner out there who just wants to simplify everything completely, the ultimate set it and forget it solution.
Yes, that would be the target date fund, specifically the low-cost, index-based versions like the Fidelity Freedom Index Fund series. These are ingenious, really. They're designed to automatically manage your asset allocation for you.
How do they do that?
They gradually shift your investment mix from being heavily weighted towards aggressive stocks when you're young, towards more conservative bonds as you get closer to your target retirement year. They follow a preset glide path. So you might pick the 2060 fund or the 2070 fund based on when you roughly plan to retire.
That sounds absolutely perfect for completely hands-off retirement planning. Seems ideal.
Yeah.
What's the biggest potential drawback?
Well, the main benefit is definitely the low cost. The index versions usually have fees around 0.12% and the sheer simplicity and automation. The potential drawback is that for some investors, these funds can become too conservative, maybe too early, as they approach and even enter retirement.
Meaning they shift too much into bonds.
Exactly. They might reduce your stock exposure too much, potentially limiting your portfolio's growth opportunities at a time when maybe you could still afford to take on a moderate amount of market risk to keep pace with inflation during a potentially long retirement. For people with a higher risk tolerance or different goals, this forced, pre-programmed conservatism is often seen as the biggest downside.
Okay, that's a really helpful breakdown of the accumulation tools. We've talked about how to build wealth using these funds, but now let's transition to actually using that wealth, generating sustainable income. The goal for many people, maybe the ultimate goal, is to cover their core living expenses, let's say $60,000 a year, which is $5,000 a month, without ever having to sell off their underlying assets, their principal.
Right. And this is where the investor mindset needs to shift pretty dramatically again. Most people, when they think income investing, immediately fall into what we might call the dividend trap.
A dividend trap.
Yeah, they just chase the absolute highest dividend yield they can find. Maybe they see a stock or fund yielding 7%, 8%, 10%, because it sounds like fast, easy, safe income.
Sounds appealing.
It does. But those really high yields often act as warning signals. They frequently indicate companies with high risk, maybe weak underlying fundamentals, or stagnant, even falling share prices. And if that juicy dividend eventually gets cut, which often happens with high-yield, low-quality companies, then poof, that safe income just vanishes overnight.
Ouch. So instead of just chasing yield, we need to focus on total return, which means combining the right mix of three key factors.
Exactly. For sustainable, growing income, you need a blend of three things. First, a reliable dividend yield. This is your starting foundation. It needs to be dependable. Second, and maybe most important, strong dividend growth. This is what compounds your income stream rapidly over time. Think about it. A consistent 15% annual dividend growth rate doubles your income payouts roughly every 5 years. That's powerful.
Okay, yield and growth. What's the third?
The third is share price appreciation. You still need the underlying value of your investments to grow over time. This builds your overall wealth and, crucially, protects your income's purchasing power against the constant erosion of inflation. That high dividend growth rate, combined with solid appreciation, is really the engine that differentiates a true long-term income strategy from just a high-yield value trap.
And that framework explains perfectly why just using a standard S&P 500 index fund strategy fails if generating high sustainable income is your primary goal.
It fails for income because the S&P 500 index has a relatively low average dividend yield, currently somewhere around, 1.2% to 1.3%?
Pretty low.
Very low. So to generate $60,000 in annual income at that yield, you would need to have amassed a portfolio worth nearly $4.7 million.
Wow, okay. Out of reach for most.
For most people, yes. The S&P 500 is designed for total growth, mostly through price appreciation, not specifically for income generation. If you try to live off it without selling shares, the income is minimal. You're essentially forced to sell off shares regularly to create your income, which isn't sustainable long term, especially if you hit a market downturn and have to sell low.
Okay, so the sources we looked at suggest building a high-performance income portfolio. One designed not just for a high starting yield, but specifically for high dividend growth over time. We're talking about strategically combining different types of funds to achieve this balance.
That's the idea. We need to target funds that track different segments of the market known for potentially higher dividend growth rates, even if their starting yield isn't sky high. For example, using a mid-cap index fund like Fidelity's FSMDX was one example, can act as your portfolio's income grower. Why? Because those mid-sized companies are often in a sweet spot. They're established enough to pay dividends, but still young and growing fast enough to increase those dividends significantly over time. We saw examples with average annual dividend growth near 24% over the last decade for some mid-cap segments.
24% growth, okay.
Yeah.
And then we incorporate some of those zero-fee options we discussed earlier, maybe for stability and basic appreciation. This is where we should probably clarify those Fidelity Zero funds again. If they literally cost nothing to hold, how does Fidelity make money on them? Is there some kind of hidden catch for the investor?
Yeah, that's an excellent point and a common question. Fidelity uses these zero funds like FNILX for large caps or FZIPX for the extended market, primarily as a very effective marketing tool. They're loss leaders to get investors onto their platform, into their ecosystem.
Okay.
They make money in other ways from those customers, maybe on the interest earned from uninvested cash balances and accounts, through securities lending of the underlying shares held in the funds, or by eventually selling customers other higher fee products or advisory services.
So is there a performance trade-off for the investor?
There's a slight technical trade-off. These zero funds don't perfectly track the standard, well-known indices like the official S&P 500. Instead, they track proprietary, custom-built Fidelity indexes that are very, very similar. However, crucially, their historical performance has been extremely close to their standard index counterparts that do charge fees. So for the average long-term investor, they represent an incredible low-cost, high-upside way to form the core base of a portfolio.
Got it. So we combine that growth-oriented mid-cap fund with the reliable base of a zero large-cap fund like FNLX. Then maybe broaden the exposure further with the zero extended market and total market funds. XITPX and FCC were examples which target smaller companies for potentially higher growth. And finally, perhaps adding a fund that offers stability and maybe focuses on quality or sustainability factors like the Fidelity U.S. Sustainability Index Fund, FITLX.
Exactly. When you strategically construct a portfolio with that kind of thinking, focusing on maximizing both dividend growth and share price appreciation, even if the starting yield is only moderate, the long-term results can be incredibly powerful. The sources showed portfolio combinations achieving, say, a starting yield of maybe 1.3% or 1.4%, but boasting an incredible 10-year average dividend growth rate somewhere around 19-20%, plus solid annual share price appreciation around 9%. That explosive dividend growth rate becomes the real engine driving your income stream upwards over time.
That growth rate really is the key differentiator. Let's try to visualize just how powerful even small, consistent investment can be when plugged into this kind of growth engine. Let's take the small start scenario from the sources. Someone starts with just a $1,000 initial investment and then commits to adding only $30 a month. Seems tiny.
Seems tiny.
Right.
Right. But that very small start, when consistently applied and allowed to compound within this type of growth-focused portfolio over, say, 30 years, it grows into a portfolio worth a surprising $441,188.
Wow. From $30 a month.
For $30 a month plus the initial $1,000. But here's the real punchline. By that 30-year mark, that portfolio would be generating approximately $729,729 in annual dividends. That's over $6,600 a month in income.
Incredible.
And get this, of that final $441,000 portfolio value, a staggering $278,595 came purely from the reinvested dividends automatically buying more shares over those 30 years. The compounding machine itself did almost all the heavy lifting, far outpacing the actual money the person contributed out of pocket.
That just perfectly illustrates the long-term payoff. But okay, for the learner who feels like they need to accelerate that goal, maybe they want to reach that $5,000 a month income target 10 years faster, what kind of commitment does that require?
It just requires shifting the starting line and increasing the regular contribution amount. We looked at an accelerated scenario, maybe start with a more substantial $20,000 lump sum, and then commit to contributing $20 a day.
$20 a day. Okay, that's about $600 a month.
Roughly $600 a month. With that disciplined approach, by year 20, so a decade sooner than the small start scenario, that portfolio reaches a value of about $914,971. And crucially, it would be generating around $68,698 in annual dividends.
Which is over $5,700 a month.
Over $5,700 a month. So you hit that $5,000 plus monthly income goal a full decade sooner. And importantly, you did it not through taking on risky leverage, like with a highly mortgaged property, but purely through consistent savings discipline and harnessing the power of compounding returns in the stock market.
Okay, so let's bring this all together and review this central conflict we've been exploring. Homeownership is, for many, a wonderful personal achievement and lifestyle goal. No argument there. But as a pure financial investment, its success seems heavily dependent on stability, stable job, stable income, stable relationship, and critically, a very long time horizon. We're talking 5, 7, or ideally 10+ years just to comfortably amortize those massive transaction costs and ongoing phantom costs. If you lack that stability or time horizon, renting is often not just an option, but a financial necessity.
Absolutely. And if you are in a position to buy, the advice from the sources is clear. Focus intensely on the controllable factors because those often matter more than trying to time the market perfectly. Work diligently on improving your credit score that impacts your interest rate and total borrowing costs more than almost anything else. And always ensure you have cash reserves outside of your down payment and closing costs because you need a buffer just in case that expensive roof repair or furnace replacement comes knocking sooner than expected.
And we established earlier that renting isn't a failure. It's not throwing money away if done strategically. Even Buffett still loves his house, right? But he loves it for the intangible value the memories created there. Financially, though, renting can simply be seen as buying you patience, giving you flexibility and time until buying makes solid financial sense for your specific situation.
Exactly. And maybe the primary non-financial goal, regardless of whether you own or rent initially, should be to try and fix your core housing costs earlier in life. Whether you eventually own your home outright or build up an investment portfolio large enough to cover your rent indefinitely, the end goal is similar. You don't want a massive mortgage payment or a massive rent payment hanging over your head deep into retirement. Property taxes and insurance will likely always be there, sure, but renters are paying those indirectly anyway. The big win is eliminating that primary mortgage or rental payment itself by maximizing your investment income engine.
Now, the data is compelling. It consistently shows that homeowners tend to have a significantly higher net worth than renters sometimes cited as 40 times greater. While we know correlation isn't causation, we really have to acknowledge that discipline gap we talked about earlier. Homeownership, for better or worse, forces a savings mechanism through those required principal payments and the necessity of budgeting for maintenance.
Which brings us directly to our final provocative thought for you, the learner, to consider. If you are currently renting, and especially if you're in one of those many markets where renting is significantly cheaper month to month than owning an equivalent property right now, what is the single greatest financial risk you are actually taking?
It's not what most people think.
It's probably not that you're paying your landlord's mortgage, as the old saying goes. The greatest financial risk, arguably, is failing to consistently and deliberately invest the savings you realize by renting cheaper than you could buy.
Ah, the Jane scenario discipline gap again.
Precisely. If the true all-in cost of owning an equivalent home in your specific area is, say, $4,000 a month, but you're currently renting a great place for only $2,000 a month, are you treating that $2,000 monthly difference with the exact same financial discipline as if it were a mandatory mortgage payment? Are you automatically sweeping that $2,000 saving into reliable, low-cost index funds every single month to systematically build your own wealth engine?
Then the market won't force you to do it.
The market won't force you. Your landlord won't force you. You have to choose to become John the disciplined renter, actively building wealth with your savings, rather than just becoming Jane the spender who lets those savings evaporate into lifestyle inflation. Think about that. Run your own numbers for your own situation, and then decide consciously where you want your capital to truly go to work for your future.